Today's story is one that is going to stay with you long after it ends. So find yourself a comfortable spot, settle in, and let me take you somewhere you have never been before. Chapter 1. We begin on the coldest morning the kingdom of Vaelthorn had seen in 11 years. The kind of cold that does not just bite, it swallows. It wraps itself around your bones and squeezes until breathing itself becomes an act of courage. The kind of cold that drives every sensible creature indoors, behind thick stone walls and roaring fires and heavy fur blankets. Every creature except one. She was there before sunrise. She was always there before sunrise. A small figure crouched at the base of the palace gates, her fingers working quickly despite the frost that had turned them a raw and painful red. She was arranging flowers, pale winter wildflowers, that she gathered herself from the frozen meadow 3 miles east of the city before the rest of the world had even opened its eyes. Snowdrops, frost lilies, pale blue heather that somehow survived where nothing else could. Her name was Seraphina, and in the kingdom of Vaelthorn, nobody knew it. She was perhaps 20 years old, though she carried herself with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had lived several difficult lifetimes inside those 20 years. Her hair was dark and tangled beneath a threadbare wool wrap. Her dress had been mended so many times that the original fabric was almost entirely replaced by patches. Her boots had a hole in the left sole that she had stuffed with dried grass to keep the frost from coming straight through. She had no cart, no stand, no sign announcing her wares. She simply sat on the cold stone ground outside the most powerful palace in the known world, and she arranged her flowers into small bundles tied with dried grass, and she waited. She could not call out to passing customers. She could not announce her prices. She could not argue when someone lowballed her or walked away without paying. Seraphina had not spoken a single word in 7 years, not since the night everything she loved was taken from her in the space of a few screaming, burning hours. Her voice had simply stopped, as if her body had decided that a world this cruel did not deserve the gift of her sound. So she waited, and she watched, and she arranged her flowers with the careful precision of someone who understood that beauty was the only language she had left. The city of Vaelthorn woke up around her like a river flowing around a stone. Guards changed shifts at the palace gates and stepped over her basket without looking down. Noble ladies emerging from their mourning carriages gathered their skirts to avoid brushing against her. Merchant boys running errands cut so close to her that the wind from their passing scattered her flower bundles across the frost-slicked stones. Not one of them saw her. This was the thing about Seraphina that the city of Vaelthorn had decided without ever discussing it. She was part of the scenery, like the worn stone gargoyles above the palace gates or the ancient iron lamp posts lining the boulevard. Present, unremarkable, invisible. She had learned not to let this break her. She had learned because she had no other choice. By mid-morning, she had sold 3 bundles, a copper coin each. She needed at least 12 sales to cover her weekly room fee at the boarding house on Mender's Lane, a crumbling building that smelled of mildew and other people's misery, but was the only place in Vaelthorn that asked no questions and required no references. She was reaching for her 4th bundle when the carriage came. It was moving too fast for the boulevard. She could hear it before she saw it, the crack of a whip, the thunder of hooves, the spray of icy mud from the wheels. She grabbed her basket and pulled it toward her chest, but she was not fast enough. The front left wheel of the carriage caught the edge of her spread, and in one single devastating second, every flower she had spent the pre-dawn hours gathering and arranging was destroyed, scattered across the stones, crushed under hooves, carried away on the cold morning wind. The carriage did not stop. The driver did not look back. A few passers-by glanced at the destroyed flowers on the ground, and then glanced at the girl sitting in the middle of them, and then looked away and kept walking. Seraphina sat very still for a long moment. She did not cry. She had learned that crying in public only attracted a different and more dangerous kind of attention. She simply looked at what remained of her morning's work, 3 bent snowdrops and a handful of crushed heather, and she began to gather them up with the same quiet precision she used for everything. She would go back to the meadow tomorrow. She would wake up earlier. She would find more flowers. She always did. She was so focused on salvaging what she could that she did not notice the shadow. It fell across her slowly, the way a cloud moves across the sun. A large, deliberate shadow that blocked the pale winter light and made the already cold air feel somehow colder. Seraphina looked up, and her heart stopped. The palace gates were open. Not the small side entrance that servants used, not the delivery arch around the back. The main gates, the great iron gates that stood 12 feet tall and were said to have not opened for any reason less than a royal procession in living memory, were open. And standing in the gap between them, with the full weight of the palace behind him and the cold morning light falling across his face like a spotlight, was the Alpha King of Vaelthorn, King Kaelan Drake, the most feared ruler in the known world. He was enormous in the way that truly powerful men are enormous, not just in height or breadth but in presence. The kind of man who made the air around him feel different, denser, charged. His dark hair was unstyled, falling across his forehead as if he had simply woken and walked out without a thought for appearances, because a man like him did not need appearances. His jaw was sharp and shadowed with several days of dark stubble. His eyes were the color of winter storm clouds, gray with lightning inside them. And they were fixed, with absolute, unwavering, inexplicable focus. On Seraphina. Not on the destroyed flowers, not on the carriage disappearing down the boulevard, not on the gathering crowd of onlookers who were now pressing close to see why the palace gates had opened. On her. Just her. Seraphina forgot to breathe. Nobody moved. The guards flanking the gates had gone rigid. The passers-by on the boulevard had stopped walking. Even the wind seemed to pause. King Kaelan Drake had not been seen outside the palace walls in 3 years. Not since the death of his father. Not since he had sealed himself inside Vaelthorn's walls and ruled his kingdom through emissaries and iron decrees, and a reputation so fearsome that most people felt relief simply knowing he stayed inside. And now he was standing at his own gates, staring at a mute flower girl sitting in the ruins of her morning's work. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not amused, not pitying. It was the expression of a man who has just seen something that does not fit inside any category his mind has prepared for and is deciding very carefully what to do about it. Then he moved. He stepped through the gates, onto the boulevard, and walked toward her. The crowd parted around him the way water parts around a ship. Nobody dared stand in his path. Nobody dared speak. A noble lady near the front of the crowd actually pressed herself flat against the wall of a nearby building and closed her eyes. He stopped 3 feet in front of Seraphina. She was still sitting on the ground, looking up at him. Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it, and she had heard enough about Alpha Kings to know that he absolutely could. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the crushed flowers on the ground around her. Then he looked back at her, and he held out his hand. Not a command, not a gesture of dismissal, a hand extended downward, open, waiting. As if he was simply offering to help her up. Seraphina stared at it. Nobody had offered her a hand in 7 years. Stay with me, Because what happens in the next 60 seconds will change both of their lives in ways neither of them can yet imagine. She reached up and took it. Chapter 2. His hand was warm. That was the first thing Seraphina noticed, and it shocked her more than anything else about this impossible moment. She had expected cold. She had expected the hand of a feared king to feel like iron and frost and controlled power. But it was warm, genuinely, deeply warm, the way a hearthstone holds heat long after the fire has died down. As if somewhere beneath the armor and the legend and the storm-cloud eyes, King Kaelan Drake was simply alive. He pulled her to her feet with a single effortless motion and then released her hand immediately. As if he was aware, acutely, carefully aware of the crowd watching every millisecond of this interaction. He did not speak to her. He did not look at the crowd. He turned back toward the palace gates, and he said one single word directed at the guard on his left, in a voice so low and controlled that only those closest could hear it. "Basket." The guard blinked, stared, looked from the king to the flower girl to the destroyed remains of her morning's work scattered across the frost-slicked stones. "Your Majesty, she is an Omega Street vendor. She is not permitted inside The Alpha King turned his head. Just his head, slowly, and looked at the guard with those storm-cloud eyes. The guard stopped speaking mid-sentence, as if someone had cut the sound from his throat. "Basket," the king repeated. The guard scrambled. He gathered what remained of Seraphina's flowers, the bent snowdrops, the crushed heather, the 3 surviving bundles, and placed the basket carefully in his arms like he was handling something suddenly, inexplicably precious. Then King Kaelan Drake turned back toward the palace, and he walked through the gates. He did not look back to see if Seraphina was following. He simply walked, with the absolute certainty of a man who has never once in his life needed to check whether his will was being carried out. Seraphina stood on the boulevard for exactly 3 seconds. The crowd was staring at her, open-mouthed, wide-eyed, 100 faces wearing the same expression of pure disbelieving shock. A noble lady near the fountain had pressed her hand over her mouth. 2 merchant boys had completely abandoned their errand and were gripping each other's sleeves. The beta, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp amber eyes, and the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years managing the impossible, stepped through the gates and stopped in front of Seraphina. His name was Aldrich, and his expression was not shock. His expression was the careful, controlled neutrality of a man who was doing rapid and desperate calculations. "You should follow," he said quietly. "When he walks away from something, he does not repeat himself." Seraphina looked at him. Then she looked at the palace. Then she picked up the hem of her patched dress, and she walked through the gates of Vaelthorn Palace. Behind her, she heard the great iron gates swing shut, and the crowd erupted. Inside the palace walls, the world was entirely different. Seraphina had looked at these walls every single day for 2 years, and somehow the reality of being inside them was nothing like what she had imagined. Everything was enormous. The courtyard alone was larger than the entire block of Mender's Lane where she slept. The stone was pale gray and immaculately maintained. Torches burned in iron brackets along every wall despite the morning hour. Servants moved in practiced silence along covered walkways, and every single one of them stopped what they were doing as Seraphina passed. They stared. She kept her eyes forward and her chin level. She had learned, in 7 years of being invisible, how to walk through hostility without letting it touch her face. King Kaelan had not waited for her. He was already disappearing through a set of heavy oak doors at the far end of the courtyard, his dark coat sweeping behind him. A young servant girl materialized at Seraphina's elbow, barely 16, with wide, frightened eyes and the look of someone who had been dispatched on an assignment she did not understand. "I am to show you to the East Wing guest quarters," the girl whispered. "My name is Bryn. Please, please just follow me and don't ask me to explain anything because I genuinely cannot." Seraphina almost smiled. She followed Bryn through a series of corridors that grew progressively warmer and more ornate, from plain servant passages to carpeted hallways lined with tapestries depicting the great battles of the Drake bloodline. Massive wolves rendered in gold and crimson thread. Kings standing over fallen enemies. A recurring symbol, a crown above a howling wolf, stitched into every border. The East Wing guest quarters turned out to be a room that was larger than the entire boarding house on Mender's Lane. A fireplace, a real bed with 4 posts and heavy velvet curtains, a washstand with actual hot water already steaming in the basin, a wardrobe that Bryn opened to reveal clothing. Clean, warm, well-made clothing in deep jewel tones that were not Seraphina's but were approximately her size. Seraphina stood in the middle of this room and turned slowly. She looked at the fire. She looked at the bed. She looked at the hot water. She sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed her raw, frost-damaged fingers against her mouth and breathed very carefully through her nose until the wave of overwhelming emotion passed. She would not cry. She never cried. But she sat there for a long moment, alone in the warmth, and let herself feel, just for a second, what it was like to be inside instead of outside, to be warm instead of cold, to exist inside 4 solid walls that were not crumbling. Then she stood up. She went to the washstand. She cleaned her hands and her face. She changed into the simplest of the provided garments, a deep green wool dress that was the finest thing she had ever worn in her life and probably cost more than 6 months of flower sales. Then she sat at the small writing desk in the corner of the room, and she waited. Because that was what Seraphina did. She waited, she watched, and she tried to understand what was happening to her before it swept her completely away. She did not have to wait long. The knock at her door came an hour later, and it was not Bryn. It was the head mistress of the palace household. Her name was Lady Marin, and she was the kind of woman who had weaponized respectability into an art form. 50 years old, immaculately dressed, with silver hair pulled back so tightly, it seemed to be pulling the expression on her face along with it. She entered the room without waiting for an answer to her knock, which, Seraphina supposed, was her way of establishing immediately who held power in this interaction. Lady Marin looked at Seraphina the way a woman looks at something that has appeared in her kitchen without invitation. Not quite disgust, not quite contempt, a very refined version of both. "I will be direct," Lady Marin said, closing the door behind her. "His Majesty has, on occasion, extended unexpected hospitality to individuals from outside the palace. It is an impulse that passes. It always passes." She paused, letting that land. "The last young woman he brought through these gates stayed for 11 days. She left quietly and has not been seen in Vaelthorn since." She let the silence do the rest of the work. Seraphina met her gaze without blinking. Lady Marin's eyes dropped briefly, involuntarily, to the writing desk, to the blank parchment and the quill laid neatly beside it. She had been briefed then. She knew about the silence. "Enjoy the room," Lady Marin said, with a smile that did not reach anything above her chin. "I suspect you won't be in it for long." She left. Seraphina sat perfectly still for a moment after the door closed. Then she reached for the quill. She dipped it in the ink. And on the blank parchment she wrote, in careful, precise letters that suggested someone who had once received a real education. I have survived worse than you." She folded the note. She placed it in the center of the writing desk. And then she went to the window and looked out at the palace gardens below and began, very quietly, to plan. Stay with me, because what Lady Marin whispered to her ally in the corridor outside, that door set in motion, a campaign that would make the next 2 weeks the most dangerous of Seraphina's life. And she hadn't even met the Alpha King properly yet. Chapter 3. The war began on the second morning. Seraphina had established a routine immediately, because routine was armor, and she had learned that lesson the hard way. She woke before dawn. She folded her bedding with military precision. She washed. She dressed. And then she did the thing that confused everyone in the palace most completely. She asked Bryn, through a written note, for flower arranging supplies. Bryn had stared at the note, then at Seraphina, then at the note again. "You want scissors, and wire, and vases." Seraphina nodded. "You are a guest of the Alpha King in the east wing of Vaelthorn Palace, and you want to arrange flowers." Seraphina smiled and nodded again. Bryn got her the supplies. And so every morning Seraphina arranged flowers, whatever the palace gardens had available, and the palace gardens, she discovered, were extraordinary. Hothouse roses in the depths of winter. Trailing jasmine kept alive by careful tending. Sprigs of dark evergreen and silver-berried holly. She arranged them with the same focused precision she brought to everything, and each morning she placed one finished arrangement outside her door. And each morning, a different arrangement appeared on the Alpha King's breakfast tray. She never signed them. She never included a note. Just the flowers. The court's campaign against her was sophisticated in the way that only truly bored and threatened people can be sophisticated. It began with the water. Seraphina had a small pitcher of drinking water delivered to her room each evening. On the third night, she noticed the faint bitter undertone before she swallowed, set the cup down carefully, and poured the contents out the window. She spent that night drinking from the washstand tap and made a note to herself: "Do not accept food or drink from anyone except Bryn." On the 5th day, her room was entered while she was in the garden. She knew because her writing materials, her most essential possession, her only voice, had been moved. Subtly, just enough for someone who lived with the hypervigilance of a survivor to notice. She checked her hidden supply, the extra parchment she had folded into the lining of the green dress, and found it untouched. Good. She had planned for this. On the 7th night, someone cut her hair while she slept. She woke to find 8 inches of her dark hair on the pillow beside her, and a pair of embroidery scissors left deliberately on the washstand. A message: "You are not safe here, you are not wanted. Leave." Seraphina sat up in bed. She looked at the scissors. She looked at her hair in the small mirror above the washstand, uneven now, shorter on one side, still long enough to pin back. She picked up the scissors. She evened out the cut herself, working carefully by firelight until it was, if not beautiful, at least intentional. Then she placed the scissors back on the washstand. And she went back to sleep. What her tormentors did not understand, what Lady Marin and her network of palace allies had fundamentally miscalculated, was that Seraphina had been surviving active hostility since she was 13 years old. This was not new. What was new, what changed everything, was the Alpha King. She had not spoken to him since her arrival, had not been summoned, had not encountered him in any corridor or courtyard. He was a presence she felt more than saw, the way you feel a storm coming before the sky has changed color. Occasionally, she would round a corner and the guards would be standing differently, more rigidly, more carefully, and she would know he had recently passed through. And every morning, the flowers disappeared from outside her door. She had no proof he was taking them, but she had no proof he wasn't. On the 8th morning, she made a decision. She arranged the flowers as usual: winter roses, dark holly, a single pale snowdrop at the center. But this time, tucked between the stems, she placed a small folded note. It said, "Why did you bring me here?" She found his answer slipped under her door before noon. It was written on palace stationery, heavy cream paper embossed with the Drake wolf crest. The handwriting was sharp and controlled, like everything else about him. It said, "I don't know yet." Seraphina read it 3 times. Then she folded it very carefully and placed it inside the lining of her dress with the spare parchment. She stood at her window for a long time after that, looking out at the palace courtyard below, watching the guards change shift and the servants cross the stones with their purposeful efficiency. And she thought about what it meant that the most powerful man in the known world had looked at her and said, "I don't know yet," with what felt impossibly, dangerously, like honesty. That afternoon, she placed another arrangement outside her door. This one had 2 notes tucked into it. The first said, "Someone is poisoning my water." The second said, "I thought you should know." That night, 3 things happened in rapid succession. First, the palace water delivery system for the East Wing was changed. New protocol, new staff, personally overseen by Beta Aldrich. Nobody explained why. Second, Lady Marin's most trusted assistant was quietly reassigned to the palace laundry. No explanation given. Third, at precisely midnight, Seraphina heard raised voices in the corridor outside her room. She pressed her ear to the door. The Alpha King's voice, low, lethal, utterly controlled, was saying something to someone in the corridor. She could not make out the words, but she could hear the tone. It was the tone of a man who has discovered that something he cares about has been threatened and is deciding, very carefully, how to respond. The corridor went silent. Then she heard footsteps, his footsteps. She was somehow certain of it, stop directly outside her door. A pause. Then they moved on. She stood at her door for a long time after that. Her heart was doing something complicated and unfamiliar in her chest. Stay with me, because at midnight on the 9th day Beta Aldrich knocked on the Alpha King's private study door and placed something on his desk that made the most feared man in the kingdom go completely and utterly still. A signet ring. Small, old, gold with a dark blue stone carved with a wolf midhowl, not the Drake wolf. A different pack entirely. A pack that had been reported dead for 7 years. Chapter 4. Beta Aldrich had been with King Kaelan Drake for 15 years. He had seen the man furious. He had seen him grief-stricken. He had seen him make decisions in the space of a single breath that other rulers agonized over for months. He had watched him bury his father and take the crown in the same week without breaking once in public. He had never seen him go still like this. The stillness of King Kaelan Drake when he saw that ring was not the stillness of shock. It was the stillness of a man who has just watched something he buried very carefully 7 years ago claw its way back to the surface. "Where did you find this?" the king asked. His voice was perfectly level. "Hidden in the lining of her dress," Aldrich said quietly. "When I had her room searched for the source of the water contamination, my team found it sewn into the seam. She has been carrying it since before she arrived here." King Kaelan picked up the ring. He turned it over in his fingers once. "The Ashenvale pack," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Aldrich said. "The Ashenvale pack, declared extinct 7 years ago after the..." "I know what they were declared." The king set the ring down on his desk with careful precision. "And I know what they were declared after." He was quiet for a moment. "What does our record show as the cause?" Aldrich hesitated. Plague. The Royal Council filed a plague declaration. The pack lands were quarantined and then absorbed into Crown territory 6 months later. And what does the actual evidence show? Another hesitation, longer this time. Aldrich. The evidence, the physical evidence from the site, was never consistent with plague, Aldrich said carefully. I reviewed the original scout reports myself 3 years ago when you asked me to audit the council's territorial acquisitions. The burn patterns, the nature of the casualties. He stopped. It was not plague, my king. King Kalen was silent for a very long time. Outside the study window, the palace grounds were dark and frost-silvered, the torches along the walls burning in the still night air. Somewhere in the east wing, 2 corridors and a courtyard away, a mute girl who sold wildflowers was sleeping in a palace room she had no reason to trust, in a place she had every reason to fear, carrying the signet ring of a dead pack sewn into the lining of her only dress. How old would the Ashenvale Alpha's daughter be now? The king asked. Aldrich did the calculation he had already done 3 times on the way to this room. 20, 21 at most. King Kalen closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them. She was 13 when it happened, he said. It was not quite a question. Yes. She survived. He was not talking to Aldrich anymore. She survived, and she has been in this city. She has been outside my gates. He stopped himself. When he spoke again, his voice was back under full control, but something underneath it was not. How long has she been selling flowers on that boulevard? Aldrich had checked this too. Our records from the gate rotation show she has been there every morning for approximately 2 years, my king. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Aldrich had ever heard. 2 years. The daughter of the Ashenvale pack, the pack whose destruction had been covered up and filed as plague by the Royal Council, had been sitting outside the palace gates for 2 years, invisible, ignored, surviving on copper coins and frost-damaged flowers. 2 years. Leave me, the king said. Aldrich left. Seraphina woke the next morning to find something had been slipped under her door overnight. Not parchment this time. A book. Old, leather-bound. She picked it up carefully and opened the cover, and her breath caught. It was a history of the great packs of Vaelthorn. The real history, not the sanitized versions sold in the city markets. A private text. She could tell from the quality and the marginalia in the margins written in several different hands across what looked like generations. She turned to the index. Ashenvale. Her hands were steady. She had learned to keep her hands steady. She turned to the page. She read. She had known the broad outline of her own story, had carried it in her bones for 7 years. But seeing it written down in careful historical ink, her father's name, her mother's name, the date of the massacre rendered as a footnote in a plague declaration, something happened in her chest that she did not have a word for. Not grief. She had processed her grief in the 7 years of surviving without it. Something colder, something with edges. At the very bottom of the Ashenvale entry, in fresh ink, different from all the other marginalia, written recently, possibly last night, someone had added 4 words in that sharp, controlled handwriting she now recognized. I was there, I'm sorry. Seraphina sat with those 4 words for a long time. I was there, I'm sorry. She thought about what they meant. She turned them over the way she turned her flower stems, looking for the angle that showed them most clearly. He had been there. The Alpha King of Vaelthorn had been present the night her pack was destroyed. He had been what? 19, 20, not yet king, his father still alive. Was he a participant, a witness? Did he give the order or watch someone else give it? Did he try to stop it? "I'm sorry" could mean many things. It could mean I did this, and I regret it. It could mean I watched this, and I did nothing. It could mean I tried to stop this and failed. It could mean I was deceived and discovered the truth too late. She did not know which one it was. And she realized, sitting in the pale winter light of the East Wing with a book of history open in her lap, that she needed to find out. Not because her next move depended on it, but because after 7 years of surviving on her own with only the story she had been running from, she needed to know the truth. The whole truth. Not a footnote, not a 4-word apology in a margin. The truth. She reached for her parchment. She wrote a single line. She folded it around the signet ring. She placed it outside her door. The note said, "Then tell me everything." He came himself, that evening. No guards, no beta, no announcement. Just a knock, different from any knock she had received before. Not the efficient rap of a servant, not the sharp, authoritative knock of Lady Marin. A single, somewhat careful knock. As if the person on the other side was uncertain. As if the most feared alpha king in the known world was standing outside a flower girl's door and was not entirely sure he had the right to be there. Seraphina opened the door. He was not in his formal state clothing. Dark trousers, a heavy shirt, no crown, no armor. He looked, she searched for the word, tired. Not weak, never weak, but like a man carrying something very heavy who has been carrying it for a very long time and has perhaps decided that this evening, in this doorway, he is going to set it down. He held up the signet ring. She looked at it. Then she stepped back from the door. And he walked in. They sat on opposite sides of the small writing table, the same table where she had written, "I have survived worse than you" on her first day. She had parchment ready. He seemed to understand immediately that this was how they would communicate. She would write, he would speak, and somehow between the two of them they would get to the truth. He told her everything. It took 2 hours. He had been 19 when his father had ordered the military campaign against the Ashenvale Pack. He had not been told the reason, only that the Ashenvale Alpha had been declared an enemy of the crown by a council vote that he later discovered had been engineered entirely by 3 council members who wanted the Ashenvale Pack lands for their own territorial expansion. He had ridden out with the military force under orders from his father. He had seen, when they arrived, that what was planned was not a military engagement. It was an extermination. He had refused to participate. He had tried to stop it. He had failed. He had watched the Ashenvale compound burn. He had spent the next year trying to find survivors, secretly, without his father's knowledge. He had found none. He had eventually been forced to accept what the official record said and to live with knowing the official record was a lie, because at 19 years old in his father's kingdom, that was all he could do. When he became king, at 22, after his father's death, his first act had been to commission Aldrich's private audit of the council's territorial decisions. He had been building a case for 3 years. He had not yet moved against the surviving council members responsible because he needed the evidence to be airtight. He needed there to be no way out for them. He needed the case to be so complete that when he brought it before the full court, they would have nowhere to run. He had not known there was a survivor. When he had found her outside his gates, he had not known who she was. He had not recognized the connection. He had simply seen a girl sitting in the ruins of something destroyed by careless power, and something in him had responded to that image with a force he did not know how to explain and had stopped trying to. When he finished speaking, the room was quiet for a long time. Seraphina was looking at the table. Then she picked up her quill. She wrote one word. She turned the parchment around and slid it across the table to him. It said, believe. She watched his face as he read it. Something moved through his expression, complicated, profound, and very human. She reached for the parchment again and wrote a second line beneath the first. I believe you, now finish it. Stay with me, because 2 days later the palace doors exploded open during the morning court session, and what walked through them changed everything. Chapter 5. The morning court session of Vaelthorn Palace was a formal affair that had not been significantly disrupted in 11 years. Nobles presented petitions. The Beta relayed military reports. The council members, 7 of them, seated in a curved arc to the right of the throne, offered their advisory opinions in the measured, careful tones of men who had spent decades ensuring that their opinions were the ones that mattered most. 3 of those council members, Lord Vaelthorn, Lord Croft, and the eldest, Lord Pembroke, had been on the council for 30 years. They had been on the council when the Ashenvale Pack lands were acquired. They had filed the Plague Declaration themselves. They had divided the territory among themselves and their families 18 months later, using intermediaries to obscure the paper trail. They had believed, for 7 years, that the trail was cold enough to be safe. They had not accounted for a king who had been building a case in silence for 3 years. They had not accounted for a girl who had been surviving in silence for 7. The court session began normally. Lord Vaelthorn was mid-sentence, something about the eastern trade routes, when the doors opened. Not burst open, not dramatically flung, simply opened with the quiet, deliberate force of someone who has decided that locked doors are merely suggestions. Beta Aldrich entered first. Behind him came 6 of the king's personal guard, not the ceremonial palace guard, but the king's wolves, the elite force that answered only to Kaelan Drake directly, identifiable by the dark insignia on their armor. And behind them, Seraphina. She was wearing deep blue today, the finest of the garments from the East Wing wardrobe, the one she had been saving. Her dark hair was pinned back with careful precision. She was carrying a single piece of parchment folded in her hand, and she was walking with the steady, level-eyed composure of someone who has been preparing for this moment for 7 years and is not going to waste a single second of it looking anything other than exactly what she was. The daughter of the Ashenvale Alpha, walking into the court of the king, who had taken her family's lands. The court erupted. Voices, questions, the scrape of chairs, Lord Pembroke rising to his feet with an expression that flickered through surprise and contempt, and something else, something underneath those, that a careful observer might have identified as fear. What is the meaning of this? Lord Vaelthorn demanded, his voice carrying the particular outrage of a man who has never had to explain himself and is suddenly being asked to. Your Majesty, this is highly irregular. Who is this person? Sit down, Vaelthorn. The Alpha King's voice cut through the noise of the room like a blade through silk. Everyone sat down. King Kaelan Drake rose from his throne slowly, unhurried, entirely controlled, and descended the 3 steps to the court floor. He walked past his council members without acknowledging them. He walked to the center of the floor where Seraphina was standing, and he turned to face his court. 7 years ago, he said, in the carrying voice of a man who has decided that the time for careful private case building is over, the Royal Council of Vaelthorn filed a plague declaration against the Ashenvale Pack. The Pack lands were quarantined and subsequently absorbed into Crown territory. The official record shows 43 Pack members deceased, cause listed as plague. He paused. The room was absolutely silent. The actual cause, he continued, was not plague. Lord Pembroke made a sound, something between a protest and a warning, and King Kaelan looked at him with those storm cloud eyes, and Pembroke closed his mouth as if it had been physically shut for him. Beta Aldrich. Aldrich stepped forward with a leather document case, thick, bound with the royal seal. 3 years of documented evidence, he said, with the calm of a man who has been waiting for this moment longer than anyone. Land transfer records, council vote documentation, military dispatch orders cross-referenced with personnel records showing no plague containment protocols were followed at any point. Financial records showing the subsequent land transfer to private holdings owned by Lords Vaelthorn, Croft, and Pembroke, respectively. And 17 witness testimonies collected under royal seal from survivors of neighboring Pact territories who observed the Vaelthorn military presence in the Ashenvale region on the night in question. He set the case on the council table. 17 witnesses, Lord Croft said, his voice strangled. Those are you cannot simply. The witnesses have been given royal protection and are currently housed within Vaelthorn's walls, Aldrich said pleasantly. They are available for court examination at your Majesty's convenience. The room had gone from eruption to a silence so complete that the torches crackling in their brackets sounded loud. Seraphina was standing very still in the center of it all. She had not moved since she entered, had not looked at the council members, had not reacted to the noise or the chaos. She was looking at the king, watching him dismantle 7 years of lies with the methodical precision of a man who had been building toward this for a very long time, and something in her chest was doing something she did not entirely have a word for. Not relief, too complicated for relief. Not satisfaction, too raw for satisfaction. Something that felt like witnessing, like standing inside a moment that was both terrible and necessary and true, and being seen inside it. Lord Pembroke found his voice. This is a fabrication, he said, and his voice, to his credit, was remarkably steady for a man watching his world collapse. A fabrication constructed around a street vendor, a nobody, who has apparently manipulated her way into the palace through. Her name, the Alpha King said, and his voice had dropped to something very quiet and very dangerous, is Seraphina of the Ashenvale Pack. She is the daughter of Alpha Corvin of Ashenvale and his bonded mate Lyris. She is the sole survivor of an extermination that your council authorized, funded, and then buried under a false plague declaration to acquire her family's lands. He paused. And she has been selling flowers outside my gates for 2 years. The silence after that was the most devastating thing in the room. Seraphina felt it move through the court, not just the nobles and the guards, but even the servants standing at the walls, the young pages near the doors. A wave of something that was not quite guilt and not quite shame, but was the collective human experience of realizing that something terrible has been happening right in front of you, and you did not see it. Lord Vaelthorn sat down very heavily. Lord Croft looked at the document case on the table as if it were a living thing. Lord Pembroke looked at Seraphina. And Seraphina, for the first time since she had entered the throne room, looked back at him. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she unfolded the piece of parchment she had been holding in her hand. She walked to the center of the room, to the royal seal stand that held the blank decree parchments and the official stamp, and she placed her paper on the stand. She picked up the court quill, and she began to write. The room watched. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. She wrote for perhaps 2 minutes, steady, deliberate, unhurried. Then she set the quill down. She turned the parchment around so that the assembled court could read it. Then she stepped back. Stay with me, because what Seraphina had written was not what anyone in that room expected. Not the council members, not the nobles, not Beta Aldrich. Not even the Alpha King. Chapter 6. The parchment said, I do not want their lands returned. I want their testimony, under oath, before this court, of every order given, every name involved, every decision made on the night my family died. I want the full truth entered into the permanent royal record of Vaelthorn so that it cannot be buried again. I want the pack lands of Ashenvale designated as protected territory, not returned to me, not absorbed by the crown, protected. A sanctuary for any pack member, Omega, or displaced wolf who has nowhere else to go. And I want it signed by the king. The court read it, then read it again. Lord Pembroke, who had been preparing, Seraphina suspected, for a property dispute, for a financial reckoning, for the kind of negotiation that powerful men know how to survive, looked at the parchment, and then at the girl who had written it with an expression she had never seen on a powerful man's face before. Something that looked very much like being undone. Because this was not the demand of someone who wanted revenge. This was the demand of someone who understood, at 20 years old, after 7 years of surviving alone, that revenge is temporary and truth is permanent. That taking back land gives you property, but entering truth into the permanent record gives you history. That the most powerful thing she could do with this moment was not to claim what had been taken from her, but to ensure that what had been done to her could never be done to anyone else. The Alpha King read the parchment. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Seraphina, and something moved across his face, unhurried, unguarded, entirely real, that made several people in the room look away as if they had accidentally witnessed something private. "Beta Aldrich," he said, "prepare 3 separate testimony chambers. Lords Vasson, Croft, and Pembroke will provide their sworn testimonies before sundown today, separately under royal oath, with full documentation." He looked at the 3 council members. "You will cooperate fully, or the evidence currently in that case will be presented directly to the full territorial court of the Northern Pax, which, as you are aware, has independent jurisdiction over interpack crimes." Lord Vasson nodded. He looked like a man who has been running for a very long time and has simply stopped. Lord Croft nodded. Lord Pembroke looked at Seraphina for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, without his earlier bluster, in the voice of a very old man, "Your father was a good alpha." Seraphina looked at him. She did not nod. She did not acknowledge it. She simply looked at him with those steady dark eyes until he looked away. The testimonies took 4 hours. Seraphina sat in a small antechamber off the main hall with Bryn, who had, at some point during the morning's events, decided that her allegiance was fully and permanently to Seraphina regardless of what it cost her, and a pot of hot tea and a stack of blank parchment. She wrote while she waited, not notes, not plans, something else, something she had not allowed herself to write in 7 years. Names, her mother's name, her father's name. The names of pack members she remembered, their faces, their particular qualities, the small details that official records never capture. She wrote them down carefully. Everyone she could remember. It took all 4 hours. When Aldrich came to tell her the testimonies were complete, she had filled 11 pages. The signing happened at dusk. The throne room again, but different now. The council seats were empty. The king's wolves stood at the walls. The remaining court members, nobles, advisors, senior staff, had gathered not because they were summoned, but because word had spread through the palace the way important things always spread, through whispers and wide eyes and the particular electricity of history being made. The royal decree was prepared. Aldrich had drafted it himself, precise legal language incorporating everything Seraphina had written on her parchment. The 3 sworn testimonies now permanently sealed into the royal record, the Ashenvale land designation as protected sanctuary territory. King Kaelan Drake stood at the signing table. He looked at the document for a moment. Then he looked at Seraphina, who was standing 3 feet away. "Is there anything you want added?" he asked. "Anything changed?" She read it through once, carefully, from beginning to end. Then she shook her head. He signed it. He pressed the royal seal. He picked it up and held it out to her. She took it in both hands. She looked at it for a long time. This document that contained her family's names and her family's truth, and the beginning of something that might eventually become justice. And she felt the 11 pages of names folded against her chest inside the blue dress, and she thought about her father and her mother, and the pack she had grown up in, and the 7 years she had spent outside palace gates in the frost. And then she did something that surprised everyone in the room. She walked to the royal decree stand, the same stand where she had written her demands that morning, and she placed the signed decree on it carefully. She reached into the small bag Bryn had brought for her. She took out a single wildflower, a pale snowdrop, the same kind she gathered in the frost before dawn, and she laid it on top of the decree. Then she stepped back, and she looked at the Alpha King. And for the first time since she had entered his palace, she smiled. It was not a grand smile, not triumphant, not performative. It was quiet and real and a little bit painful. The smile of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just, finally, been allowed to set it down. King Kaelan Drake looked at the smile. And something in his face, something that had been held very carefully in place for a very long time, quietly came undone. Chapter 7. 3 things happened in the week that followed. The first, Lords Vasson, Croft, and Pembroke were stripped of their council seats. Their territorial holdings that had come from the Ashenvale lands were transferred to the new sanctuary designation, and formal charges were filed with the Northern Pax Territorial Court. They were not imprisoned. The Alpha King's legal case, thorough as it was, operated within Vaelthorn law, and Vaelthorn law at the council level was complicated, but they were finished. Their names were in the permanent record alongside their sworn testimonies. Their families would know. Their allies would know. History would know. It was not everything, but it was, as Seraphina had understood from the beginning, the most durable form of justice available, the kind that could not be bought back or negotiated away. The second thing, word began to spread about the Ashenvale sanctuary designation, about the protected territory, about what it was for. Aldrich had quietly ensured that the information reached the right channels, pack networks, Omega communities, the informal systems that displaced and vulnerable wolves used to find safety. By the end of the first week, 3 families had arrived at the Ashenvale territory boundary, asking for sanctuary. By the end of the month, there were 19. The third thing, Seraphina stayed. Not in the East Wing guest quarters, not as a visitor with uncertain status. The Alpha King had a very direct conversation with Beta Aldrich about the formal designation of her presence within the palace, a conversation that Aldrich reported back to the senior staff with the carefully neutral expression of a man keeping his opinion entirely to himself. She was given a permanent suite in the North Wing, a writing desk, a garden access pass, a small hothouse plot she could tend herself. And every morning, without fail, a wildflower arrangement appeared outside the Alpha King's study door. And every morning, without fail, there was a note tucked into it. Sometimes the notes were practical. The hothouse roses need more water. Sometimes they were observations. The guard on the east gate has been limping for 3 days. He needs to see the healer, but he is too proud to ask. Sometimes they were questions. What was your father like before everything changed? And every day, without fail, There was an answer slipped under the door of the North Wing's suite. Sometimes short, sometimes, as the weeks passed, not short at all. The first time he heard her voice, he was not prepared for it. It was late. She did not know he was in the corridor. She was alone in the small garden attached to the North Wing in the dark, tending the hothouse plot by the light of a single lantern, and she was humming, quietly, almost below the threshold of hearing. A melody he did not recognize, something old and slow and achingly tender, the kind of song that belongs to specific places and specific people, and is sung without thinking because it has been in the body longer than conscious memory. He stopped walking. He stood in the corridor doorway and listened. He did not announce himself, did not move, barely breathed. The humming continued for perhaps 2 minutes. Then it stopped. She had noticed the change in the air, the way a person always notices when they are no longer alone. And there was a pause, and then she turned and saw him standing in the doorway. They looked at each other across the small, dark garden. He could see her deciding whether to be embarrassed, whether to be guarded, whether to retreat behind the safety of her silence. She decided against all three. She turned back to her plants, and she kept humming. He stood in the doorway for a little while longer. Then he sat down on the low stone wall at the edge of the garden, and he stayed until the lantern burned low. The voice came back slowly. Not all at once, not dramatically. The way feeling comes back to a limb that has been numb for a long time, first as tingling, then as discomfort, then as the surprising and overwhelming reality of sensation returning to something you had forgotten was capable of feeling. First it was the humming, which she stopped hiding. Then it was sound, small sounds, not words, the breath before a word, the beginning of a consonant. Then one morning, a Tuesday, unremarkable in every other way, frost on the garden and a pale winter sun, Bryn came to the North Wing's suite to bring breakfast, and Seraphina opened the door and said, in a voice that was rusty and uncertain and entirely real, "Thank you." Bryn burst into tears on the spot. Seraphina, alarmed, handed her a handkerchief and a written note that said, "Please stop. You are making me feel responsible for this," which made Bryn cry harder. She did not tell the Alpha King right away. She was not sure why. Perhaps because some things needed to be kept close for a while before they were shared. Perhaps because the return of her voice felt still, like something fragile that needed to find its shape before it was tested. She told him the way she told him most important things, through a note. It said, "I spoke to Bryn this morning. 2 words I thought you should know." His response came back within the hour. It said, "I know. She told approximately 14 people before noon." The head cook cried, "I am pretending I don't know so you can tell me yourself when you're ready." She read that note 4 times. Then she wrote back, "You are surprisingly terrible at being intimidating." His response, "Only around you. Don't tell anyone." She told him herself on a Thursday evening in the small garden, by lantern light, with the frost on the flagstones and the hothouse roses doing their impossible winter blooming behind them. He was sitting on the low stone wall, his usual spot now, established over weeks of quiet evenings, and she was across from him on the garden bench, and she had been building toward this for several minutes in the particular way of someone who has been silent for a very long time and is still learning that words are safe. She said his name. Just his name, Kaelan. Not your majesty, not King Drake, his name. He went very still, the same stillness as when he had seen the signet ring, but entirely different in quality. That stillness had been the stillness of confronting something buried. This was the stillness of something opening. He looked at her. She said, and her voice was still finding itself, still a little rough at the edges, still learning how to carry the weight of everything she needed it to carry. Thank you for opening the gates. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for being there when I did." The frost settled around them. The lantern burned. The roses bloomed in their impossible winter way behind the glass of the hothouse. And somewhere in the palace, in the permanent royal record, in the signed decree with its snowdrop pressed between the pages, in the 11 pages of names folded carefully and kept close, the Ashenvale Pack existed again. Not as a footnote, not as a plague statistic, as a truth, as a sanctuary, as something that would outlast everyone in this garden by centuries. Seraphina looked at the man across from her. She thought about 7 years of frost and copper coins and crushed flowers, and surviving by herself in a world that had decided not to see her. She thought about a pair of gates swinging open. She thought about a warm hand extended downward, open, waiting. She reached into her coat pocket. She took out a single snowdrop. She always had one old habit, and she held it out to him. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took it. And he did something she had not expected, something that made her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He tucked it into the buttonhole of his coat, as if it belonged there, as if it had always belonged there. And for the first time in 7 years, Seraphina of the Ashenvale Pack was not invisible. She was not outside the gates. She was not surviving. She was home. The end. Hello, friends. Thank you so much for staying with me through this story. If Seraphina's journey moved you the way it moved me writing it, drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the gates opening? The note that said, "I was there, I'm sorry," or the snowdrop in the buttonhole at the end? And wherever you are watching from, drop your city in the comments. This community is worldwide, and I love seeing where you are all finding us. If you are new here, welcome home. Subscribe and come back, there are more stories waiting for you. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Goodbye, friends.